Welcome to AudioCert, where the official study guides are brought to life. I'm your host, and today we're taking a deep dive into EC Council CEHv13, Module 11, a really critical topic in cybersecurity, session hijacking. Our mission, as always, is to cut through the technical noise, pull out those crucial insights, and hopefully give you some genuine aha moments. We want to make sure you, our listener, are truly well-informed on this concept. So let's paint a picture. Imagine you've just securely logged into your bank, maybe your email or your favorite online store. You're browsing, doing your thing, everything feels normal. And then, bam, without any warning, someone else just slips in and takes control of your active online session. They can see what you see, do what you do, buy stuff. They essentially become you online. It's like they've silently hopped into the driver's seat of your car while it's running, and you don't even notice until they drive off.
Yeah, that's not just a scary thought experiment. It's the very real and often incredibly stealthy threat we call session hijacking. It's a pretty sophisticated attack, really. It bypasses that whole initial authentication step and jumps straight into an active trusted connection. It basically exploits the trust that's already been set up between your browser and the server. It's a huge challenge because, it sidesteps a lot of the usual login protections we rely on.
That is quite sobering. So how on earth does something like that even happen? And I guess more importantly, how do we actually stop it? It fundamentally breaks the idea of a secure login, doesn't it?
It does feel that way, yeah.
Yeah.
And it is unsettling, but understanding it is definitely our best defense.
Yeah.
So in this deep dive, we'll unpack the core concepts, look at the fundamental weaknesses that make these attacks work so well. We'll break down the different levels where they happen on the application level, the network level, and we'll examine the specific methods and tools attackers use. And crucially, we'll arm you with the countermeasures, the ways to protect against them.
Yeah.
It's really about seeing the whole picture, the offense and the defense.
Okay, so it's kind of like learning how a magician does their tricks, not just to spot the trick, but so you can design a stage or maybe a lock where those tricks just don't work anymore. We need to know how they get in so we can properly bolt the door. Session hijacking concepts. Understanding the fundamentals. Session hijacking concepts. A. What exactly is session hijacking? Right. Let's start with the basics then. When we say session hijacking, what's the working definition we're using here?
Okay, at its core, session hijacking is an attack where someone unauthorized, an attacker, seizes control of a valid, ongoing communication session. Usually we're talking about a TCP transmission control protocol session between two legitimate computers. Think of it like someone barging into a private phone call that's already in progress and authenticated.
And why is that specific part the ongoing conversation? Why is that so dangerous? Shouldn't, every click or action require you to prove who you are again?
That's exactly where the vulnerability lies. See, most authentication, it only happens right at the start of the session. Once you've logged in, the server doesn't keep asking for your password every single time you do something. Instead, it relies on something called a session identification token, or sometimes a session key. This token acts like your temporary pass, proof that you're the legitimate person in that ongoing conversation. Going back to your analogy, it's like passing airport security. Your boarding pass gets checked, you get on the plane. Once you're seated, they're not checking your pass every time you, ask for a drink or go to the restroom. That session ID is your onboard pass. If someone manages to snatch that pass after you've boarded, they can wander around the plane pretending to be you, and they never had to go through the initial security check themselves. The server trusts the pass, the session ID, not necessarily the person holding it moment to moment.
Okay, so the attacker's main goal isn't really cracking your initial password. It's stealing that onboard pass, that valid session ID. Then they can just impersonate you and talk to the server like they're you. They're not breaking down the front door. They're finding a way to get a copy of the key after the door's already open.
Precisely. And the fallout can be huge. We're talking identity theft, stealing sensitive information, financial fraud. It's serious stuff. Attackers can even use a hijack session as a launchpad for other attacks, maybe setting up a man-in-the-middle or MITM situation, or even launching a denial of service, a DOS attack, against the server. Once they control your session, they can basically do anything you could do on that system. And that makes it incredibly hard to spot early on.
B. Why is session hijacking so successful? Unpacking the vulnerabilities.
Right, which leads to the really big question. What makes these attacks work so often? What are the fundamental weaknesses, the soft spots that attackers keep hitting? That's a great question. It really comes down to a mix of how things are built architecturally and, frankly, some common mistakes in how systems are set up. There are several key factors. First off, a surprisingly common issue is the absence of account lockout for invalid session IDs. Think about it. If a website doesn't block you after, say, 5 wrong password attempts, what about 5 wrong session ID attempts? Or 5,000? If there's no limit, an attacker can just keep guessing. Imagine a lock that never jams no matter how many junk keys you try. An attacker can brute force to systematically try every possibility until they stumble on the right session ID. And often, there are no alarms, no warnings triggered. It's a quiet, persistent guessing game.
Wow, so they can just keep trying indefinitely without any real penalty. That seems like a massive oversight for something so important.
It really is. And it ties into the next big weakness: weak session ID generation algorithms, or just using session IDs that are too short. A lot of websites, historically anyway, used very predictable ways to create these tokens. Maybe they were based on the time or the user's IP address, or sometimes just simple sequential numbers. If you see tokens like user 1001, then user 1002, well, it doesn't take a genius to guess user 1003 might be next.
Right.
Or maybe the ID includes a timestamp, like USER 22-40903-1430. If the attacker knows the format and the current time, they can make pretty good guesses. And even if the algorithm itself is strong, if the resulting session ID string is too short, there just aren't enough possible combinations. That makes brute forcing trying all options much more feasible.
Okay, so predictable patterns are just not enough unique IDs to guess from, but what if the session ID is actually generated securely, nice and long and random? How would an attacker get their hands on that?
That leads us to the third vulnerability: insecure handling of session IDs. A perfectly good ID can still be compromised if it's not protected properly. Attackers have various tricks up their sleeves here, things like DNS poisoning, that's domain name system poisoning, or exploiting cross-site scripting, XSS vulnerabilities, or even finding bugs in your browser itself. These methods can trick your browser into revealing that stored session ID. Essentially, they manipulate the environment around the session ID or the browser holding it to make it give up the secret. And then there's the problem of indefinite session timeouts, or just really, really long ones. If a session ID essentially never expires, an attacker has basically forever to try and steal it and use it. Think about that "Remember Me" checkbox you see on login pages. Super convenient, right? But often, it means a persistent session ID gets stored in a cookie on your computer for weeks, maybe months. If an attacker manages to grab that cookie file somehow, maybe through malware, they could potentially gain long-term access to your account without ever needing your password again.
Now, here's where I get really curious. Are the basic building blocks of the internet, the protocols themselves, part of the problem? Is there something fundamentally flawed in, say, TCP/IP that makes this possible?
That's a fantastic question, and it heads on a deeper truth. Yes, absolutely.
Right.
To some extent, the very design of TCP/IP Transmission Control Protocol Internet Protocol makes all machines using them inherently vulnerable to certain kinds of session hijacking. These protocols are the bedrock of the internet, but they were designed decades ago when the threat landscape looked very different. They lack things like inherent encryption or strong authentication at those lower layers. They often operate on assumptions of trust that modern attackers are, well, very happy to exploit. So some fundamental weaknesses are just baked into the system, regardless of how well a specific application is written on top of it. And one last point here: countermeasures often fail without proper encryption. Just using SSL, or its successor TLS transport layer security, isn't a magic bullet. If the session ID cookies themselves aren't properly secure during that encrypted transmission, may be flagged correctly, or if they contain information that can still be useful if intercepted even while encrypted, then just having SSL TLS might not be enough to prevent certain types of session hijacking or information leakage. It's not just about having encryption. It's about how and where those critical session tokens are protected throughout their life cycle. C, the session hijacking process, a step-by-step breakdown.
Okay, so if an attacker decides they want to take over someone's session, what are the actual steps they generally follow? It sounds like it's probably more involved than just one quick action.
You're absolutely right. It's usually a multi-stage process. We can generally break it down into 3 broad phases. Phase 1 is tracking the connection. This is basically the reconnaissance stage. The attacker uses network sniffing tools. Things like Wireshark are common to passively monitor the network traffic between the victim and the target host, like a web server. Their main goal here is to capture the TCP sequence and acknowledgement numbers, the SEKI numbers. These numbers are absolutely crucial because they dictate the expected order of packets in the conversation. Think of it like eavesdropping on a conversation to learn the specific rhythm and the little verbal nods or phrases two people use to know they're talking to each other. You're trying to learn that pattern so you can convincingly mimic one of them.
Okay, so they listen in, they learn the rhythm, the sequence numbers. How do they then actually inject themselves into that conversation without just getting ignored or causing errors?
That takes us to phase 2, desynchronizing the connection. This is where they actively disrupt the flow. The goal is to make the client machine and the server machine have a different understanding of the current state of the connection to get them out of sync. One way to do this is by sending null data. The attacker might flood the server with packets containing just empty data. The server processes these, which makes its internal sequence number counters move forward. But the legitimate client never saw this null data, so its sequence numbers don't advance. Now they're out of sync. The server is expecting a packet with a higher sequence number than the client is prepared to send. Another common technique, sometimes used to initiate the takeover, is sending a reset, or RST, flag. The attacker sends a carefully crafted RST packet, appearing to come from the client, directly to the server. This tells the server, hey, drop this connection. Almost at the exact same moment, the attacker sends a new synchronize or SYN packet to the server, but this one has a different sequence number, trying to establish what looks like a legitimate new connection, but using the victim's identity. The server, having just dropped the real client, might accept this new SYN from the attacker, thinking the original client is just reconnecting. It's a tricky timing maneuver. Using a finish, or FIN, flag instead of RST can be risky for the attacker, though. It might trigger what's called an ACK storm, basically an endless loop of acknowledgments going back and forth that don't match up, which could alert someone that something weird is happening.
Wow, okay. So they deliberately throw a wrench into the works, create confusion to make an opening for themselves. Once they've successfully messed up the synchronization, what's the payoff? What's phase 3?
Phase 3 is the goal, injecting the attacker's packet. Once the connection is successfully interrupted and desynchronized, the attacker can now inject their own malicious data packets into the stream directed at the server. At this point, they can often become a full man in the middle, sitting between the client and server, able to read, modify, and inject data however they want. They effectively take control of the conversation. The server thinks it's talking to the legitimate client. Maybe the client thinks it's still talking to the server, or just sees a dropped connection. But really, the attacker is pulling the strings. Deep packet analysis of a local session hijack. What the packets tell us.
Let's zoom in even closer then. What does this look like right down at the packet level, especially in a local network scenario where the attacker might be on the same network segment? What specific information are they laser focused on?
Right, drilling down locally, it still revolves around those 3 core actions: tracking, desynchronizing, injecting. And it all hinges on exploiting the TCP three-way handshake, that initial SYN, ACK exchange that kicks off every TCP connection. Session hijacking fundamentally messes with this established process. The absolute golden ticket for an attacker trying to take over an active session is predicting the next sequence number, or NSN. This is the exact sequence number that the legitimate client is about to use for its very next packet. If the attacker can figure out this NSN and manage to send a packet with that number to the server before the real client does, they can effectively hijack the flow. How do they find the NSN? Well, the most common way is by sniffing the network traffic and looking at the acknowledgement, or ACK, packets coming back from the server. These ACKs implicitly reveal the next sequence number the server is expecting. Guessing is possible, but much less reliable, especially with modern operating systems that randomize these numbers. But in a local session hijack scenario where the attacker's on the same network, sniffing that traffic to accurately determine the sequence numbers becomes much easier. They have a front row seat to the conversation's packet flow, types of session hijacking. Active versus passive.
Okay, so are all these hijacking attacks basically the same in how they operate, or do we categorize them based on how involved the attacker is?
That's a good distinction to make. We generally classify them into 2 main types based on the attacker's level of interaction: passive session hijacking and active session hijacking. In passive session hijacking, the attacker is more like an observer, an eavesdropper. Once they gain some level of network access, they primarily use sniffing tools to monitor and record the traffic. Their goal is usually to collect sensitive information, think usernames, passwords, session IDs that they can then use later to gain unauthorized access. They aren't interfering with the live session itself, they're just gathering intel. A classic example is password sniffing on an unsecured network. Countermeasures against passive sniffing often involve things like one-time password systems or robust authentication protocols like Kerberos. These help protect credentials from being simply scooped up, but they might not stop an active attack if the data itself is flying around unencrypted or unsigned later on.
Right, so passive is like spying and taking notes. What does active hijacking look like then?
Active session hijacking is much more, active. This is where the attacker directly takes over an existing, established session. They might achieve this by forcibly breaking the connection on one side, maybe kicking the legitimate user off so they think their session just died, or by actively inserting themselves in the communication flow as a man in the middle. The big challenge for active attacks, especially against modern systems, is dealing with those sequence numbers. Most operating systems now use randomized initial sequence numbers, or ISNs. This makes it significantly harder for an attacker to accurately guess the next sequence number needed to seamlessly inject packets into an ongoing session without being immediately detected as out of order. Fixation hijacking the OSI model, where attacks happen.
How does all this fit into the bigger picture of network layers, the OSI model? Where in that stack do these session hijacking attacks typically take place?
That's a great way to visualize it. Session hijacking attacks generally operate at two main levels within the OSI or Open Systems Interconnection: model.network-level hijacking and application-level hijacking. Network-level hijacking targets the lower layers, specifically the transport layer, think TCP, UDP, User Datagram Protocol, and the network layer, IP Internet Protocol. This involves intercepting packets during transmission. Attackers often like this level because the vulnerabilities can be more fundamental and widespread. They don't necessarily need to tailor the attack for every single different web application. They're attacking the common protocols underneath. Successfully hijacking at the network level can also provide crucial information, like valid sequence numbers or session context, which then fuels attacks at the higher application level. It's like attacking the highway system itself. Then you have application-level hijacking. This focuses specifically on the top layer, layer 7, usually targeting HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol.
The goal here is to gain control over a user's web session, typically by stealing or manipulating their session ID, that token the web server uses to recognize them after login. Once the attacker has a valid session ID, they can hijack the existing session, or maybe even create new unauthorized sessions using that stolen credential. And very often, these two levels work hand in hand. An attacker might use network-level techniques to first sniff out a session ID and then use that ID to perform an application-level hijack, spoofing versus hijacking. A crucial distinction.
We hear terms like spoofing and hijacking thrown around a lot. Sometimes they seem almost interchangeable. Are they the same thing, or are there really important differences we need to keep straight?
That's a really critical distinction to make, and yeah, they do get mixed up easily. Both involve impersonation, but they happen at fundamentally different stages of a connection. A spoofing attack is when an attacker pretends to be someone else, another user or another machine, the victim right from the start to gain access. The key difference is that they initiate a brand new session using false credentials or a faked source identity. They aren't taking over something already running. Simple IP spoofing is a classic example, sending packets with a fake source IP address to trick the receiver into thinking they came from a trusted entity. This is often easier to pull off and is a component in many other attacks, though crafting those raw packets usually requires special privileges, like root access. Session hijacking, conversely, is when an attacker seizes control of an existing active session. They rely on the legitimate user to do the hard work first, establish the connection, authenticate successfully. Then the attacker finds a way to muscle the legitimate user out and take their place, continuing the session seamlessly. This is generally much harder than simple spoofing. It requires knowing the current sequence number in use, having a method to actually displace the legitimate user, maybe using a denial of service tactic, and having very precise timing and knowledge of the session's state.
Got it. So spoofing is like showing up with a fake ID to try and get into the party. Hijacking is like sneaking up behind someone already inside the party and taking their wristband while they're not looking.
That's a perfect analogy. And related to hijacking, you sometimes hear about blind hijacking. This is a specific type where an attacker injects data into an ongoing TCP session, usually by predicting sequence numbers. But here's the catch. They cannot see the reply packets coming back from the server. They're essentially sending commands or data into the void, hoping they guessed the sequence numbers correctly and that their commands are executed, but they get no direct feedback. This relies heavily on being able to predict those initial sequence numbers, ISNs, which, as we said, is tough with modern randomization. They're flying blind, hence the name.
Okay, so let's bring encryption back in. If a network is using really strong per-packet integrity checks, or robust encryption like SSL/TLS, or maybe even something like PPTP, point-to-point tunneling protocol for a VPN, then neither basic IP spoofing nor session hijacking should really work, should they? Because the attacker can't fake the integrity checks or participate in the secure key exchange.
You've nailed it. That's absolutely right. If you have strong end-to-end encryption and mechanisms that verify the integrity of every single packet, an attacker is largely shut out. They can't decrypt the traffic to find the necessary sequence numbers or session keys. They can't forge packets that will pass the integrity checks. They can't insert themselves into the secure key exchange process. So yeah, robust cryptographic controls are a fundamental defense against both IP spoofing and many forms of session hijacking at the network layer. It really highlights why encryption and data integrity are so critical. 2. Application-level session hijacking. Exploiting user sessions.
Compromising the session token.
All right, let's shift gears now and really dig into the application level. We've covered the general idea, but specifically for web applications, how do attackers usually manage to get their hands on those really valuable session tokens?
Okay. Yeah, moving up the stack to the application layer, the focus is almost entirely on that HTTP session, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol session. It really boils down to finding ways to steal, guess, or maybe brute force those unique session IDs that a web server hands out after you log in. That ID is how the server remembers you from one click to the next. If network-level hijacking is like picking the lock on the main door, application-level hijacking is more like finding a spare key someone carelessly left under the mat, or maybe figuring out the pattern the locksmith uses to cut keys for that building. Attackers are probing for any weakness in how that session token is generated, how it's sent back and forth, or how the web application itself handles and validates it. B methods of compromising session IDs.
Makes sense. So what are some of the go-to techniques attackers use to compromise these session IDs at the application level? Sounds like they have quite a toolbox.
They definitely do. And different techniques target different kinds of weaknesses, whether it's in the application's code, the server configuration, or even user behavior. Let's walk through some common ones. First, the most straightforward is probably using sniffing. If the website isn't using HTTPS for everything, or if there is a point where encryption breaks down, an attacker on the same network can use packet sniffing tools like Wireshark again, or maybe Riverbed Packet Analyzer. They intercept the HTTP traffic and just read it. They look for those session IDs, maybe even passwords if they're sent insecurely. Once they spot a valid session ID, maybe it's in a cookie or embedded right in the URL or in the body of an HTTP request, the attacker can just copy it. Then they send that stolen ID to the web server in their own browser, and boom, they're logged in as the victim.
Right, so unencrypted traffic is just an open invitation. What about trying to predict the tokens if they can't sniff them directly?
That's the next major category. Predicting session tokens. If an application uses a weak algorithm to generate those IDs, attackers can try to figure out the pattern. They might collect a bunch of session IDs from the site, maybe by creating multiple accounts or logging in repeatedly, and then study them. Are there parts that seem sequential? Parts based on time? Parts related to the username or IP? If they spot a pattern, like IDs going ABC101, ABC102, ABC103, they can predict the next one. Or if it uses a timestamp like token 20240903 1500 XYZ, they can guess based on the current time and the known format. And like we mentioned before, even if it's not strictly predictable, if the total number of possible IDs, the token space size is too small, say only 4 or 5 digits, then brute force attacks become practical. They just try guessing thousands of IDs until one works, especially if the site doesn't limit how many guesses you can make. This whole category is often called a session prediction attack.
Wow, so even IDs that look random might have a hidden predictable structure. Okay, if we keep mentioning man-in-the-middle attacks, or MITM, how do they fit in specifically at the application level to grab session IDs?
Right. An MITM, or manipulator in the middle, attack at the application level works by inserting the attacker directly into the communication path between the user's browser and the web server. They effectively split that single connection into 2 separate ones. The user talks to the attacker, and the attacker talks to the server, relaying messages back and forth. Once they're in that position, the attacker can see everything passing between the user and the server, including session cookies, form submissions, you name it. They can easily pluck out the session ID as it travels, or even modify requests and responses on the fly. The user thinks they have a secure connection to the server thinks it's talking directly to the user, but the attacker controls the whole conversation.
And then there's the variation man in the browser. Sounds similar, but you said it's critically different. How so?
Yeah. Man in the browser, or MITB manipulator in the browser, is similar in outcome but very different in execution. Instead of intercepting traffic on the network, this attack uses malware, usually a Trojan horse, that gets installed directly onto the user's computer. This malware then hooks into the browser itself. It intercepts and manipulates the communication between the browser application and its own internal security mechanisms or libraries. So it can change what the user sees on a web page or change the data the user submits in a form before it even leaves the browser and after any SSL/TLS encryption might have been applied by the browser. This makes it incredibly dangerous, especially for things like online banking. The user might see a legitimate-looking transfer request for $100, but the malware changes it to $10,000 destined for the attacker's account before the browser sends it. And crucially, because the manipulation happens inside the trusted browser environment, things like SSL, PKI, public key infrastructure, even some forms of two-factor authentication might not detect it. The browser thinks it's doing what the user intended, and the server receives what looks like a legitimate encrypted request.
That is incredibly insidious. It basically turns the user's own trusted tool against them. What about attacks that exploit vulnerabilities directly in the browser or its plugins, the client-side stuff?
Exactly. Those fall under the umbrella of client-side attacks. They leverage flaws in the software running on the user's machine, the browser, maybe Java runtime environment, browser extensions, or vulnerabilities on the websites themselves that allow malicious code to run in the user's browser. The most famous example here is cross-site scripting, or XSS. This is where an attacker manages to inject malicious scripts, usually JavaScript, but could be VBScript, HTML, Flash, into a web page that other users will view. For instance, an attacker might post a comment on a forum that contains a hidden script. When you view that forum page, the script runs in your browser, potentially with the privileges of the website you're visiting. A common XSS attack is to steal session cookies. The script might grab your document.cookie value, which often contains the session ID, and send it off to the attacker's server. They could also embed malicious JavaScript to capture keystrokes, or use Trojans to change your browser's proxy settings so all your web traffic gets secretly routed through the attacker's machine first.
Okay, another cross-site one, cross-site request, forgery, or CSRF. How is that different from XSS?
Good question. They sound similar, but exploit trust in opposite directions. Cross-site request forgery, CSRF, sometimes called session writing, exploits the website's trust in the user's browser. XSS exploits the user's trust in a website. With CSRF, the attacker crafts a malicious request, maybe embedding it in an image tag or a form on a website they control. If you, the victim, are logged into a legitimate site, say your bank, in one browser tab, and then you visit the attacker's malicious page in another tab, that malicious page can trigger your browser to send a request to your bank using your existing authenticated session cookies. Your bank server receives the request, sees your valid session cookie, and thinks you genuinely intended to perform that action, like transferring funds, changing your password, etc., even though you did nothing. The attacker is forging a request that rides on your already established session.
Okay, shifting tactics slightly. What about session replay attacks? This sounds like just recording and playing back.
That's pretty much it. In a session replay attack, the attacker first eavesdrops on the communication between a client and server, maybe using network sniffing. They capture the user's authentication token or session ID as it's sent. Then, at a later time, the attacker simply replays that captured token or session ID back to the server. If the server doesn't have mechanisms to detect replayed credentials like nonces or timestamps, it might accept the replay token as valid and grant the attacker access as the original user. It's like recording someone saying the password and playing it back later.
Now, this next one sounds counterintuitive. Session fixation. You mentioned the attacker gives you a session ID. How does that work?
Yeah, session fixation is a clever twist. Instead of stealing your session ID after you log in, the attacker fixes your session ID before you log in. This relies on a vulnerability where the web application allows session IDs to be specified, perhaps in the URL, before authentication. Here's the flow. 1. The attacker first visits the target website and gets a valid session ID from the server for themselves. Let's say it's SID123. 2. Then, the attacker tricks the victim into using that specific session ID. Maybe they send the victim a phishing email with a link like http://vulnerablebank.com.sid, SID1232. Then, the attacker tricks the victim into using that specific session ID. Maybe they send the victim a phishing email with a link like http. 3. The victim clicks the link. Their browser now uses SID123 as its session identifier for that site. 2. Then, the attacker tricks the victim into using that specific session ID. Maybe they send the victim a phishing email with a link like http://. The victim then proceeds to log in normally with their own username and password. 5. Here's the crucial part. The server associates the victim's authenticated state with the session ID SID123, the one the attacker already knows. 5. Here's the crucial part. 6. Now, the attacker can just use SID123 in their own browser, and they'll have access to the victim's authenticated session because the victim effectively logged into the session the attacker provided.
That's sneaky. They set the trap, you walk into it, and activate it with your own login. What about using proxy servers? How does that facilitate hijacking?
Session hijacking using proxy servers is another MITM variant. The attacker lures the victim to click on a fake link, perhaps disguised as a legitimate offer. Click here for 50% off. This link doesn't go directly to the real site, say Amazon.com, but instead redirects the victim's browser to the attacker's server first. The attacker server then acts as a proxy. It forwards the victim's requests onto the real Amazon server, gets the responses, and forwards them back to the victim. To the victim, it looks like they're interacting with Amazon directly. But because all the traffic is flowing through the attacker's proxy, the attacker can capture everything: login credentials, session cookies, browsing activity, purchase details. They're the invisible intermediary recording the whole transaction.
Okay, now for some specific named attacks. What's the crime attack? That stands for compression ratio. Info leak made easy, right? Sounds ominous.
It does sound dramatic. The crime attack is a client-side attack that exploits vulnerabilities in data compression features used by protocols like SSL TLS, SPDY, and particularly HTTPS. The goal is to decrypt secret session cookies embedded within HTTPS traffic, allowing the attacker to hijack authenticated sessions. How it works is complex, but essentially, the attacker tricks the victim, maybe via social engineering, into visiting a malicious web page or injects malicious JavaScript. If the victim has an active HTTPS session with a target site, like their bank, the attacker, who might also be performing an MITM attack like ARP spoofing to sniff the traffic, starts sending multiple crafted HTTPS requests to the target site. These requests include parts of the user's encrypted session cookie along with attacker-controlled data. By observing the length of the compressed HTTPS responses from the server, the attacker can infer information about the original, uncompressed secret cookie character by character. Compression algorithms compress known data more efficiently, so changes in length reveal information about the secret. Tools like CrimeCheck can help detect vulnerability.
Interesting. Exploiting compression itself. What about the forbidden attack, another MITM targeting HTTPS?
Yes, the forbidden attack is another type of man-in-the-middle attack, specifically targeting HTTPS sessions. It exploits a vulnerability related to the reuse of a cryptographic nonce, a number used only once, during the TLS handshake. Specifically, it targets implementations using the AES-GCM Advanced Encryption Standard with GalOS Counter Mode Cipher Suite, where incorrectly the same nonce might be reused for encrypting data with the same key. If an attacker can trigger this nonce reuse, they can potentially derive the cryptographic keys used for the session. This allows them to decrypt the traffic, hijack the connection, and inject malicious content, like fake login fields or JavaScript, to steal sensitive information like passwords or bank details.
And session donation attacks. So the attacker donates their session. What's the catch there?
Exactly. It sounds helpful, but it's malicious. In a session donation attack, the attacker first logs into a service themselves and obtains their own valid session ID. Then, they somehow trick the target user into using that attacker-provided session ID, maybe through a link, like in session fixation or cross-site cooking or MITM. Now here's the catch. The victim clicks the link, goes to the site, and enters their sensitive details, maybe their username, password, credit card number, for a purchase. But because they are using the attacker's donated session ID, all those details get linked to the attacker's account or session context on the server. The victim thinks they're logging into their own account or making a purchase for themselves, but they are actually performing actions within the attacker's pre-established session, potentially adding their credit card to the attacker's profile, for instance.
Wow, that's devious. You think you're securing your account, but you're actually handing your details over within the attacker's context.
Yeah.
Okay, last one in this section. PetitPotam Hijacking. You touched on this earlier, targeting domain controllers.
Right. PetitPotam is a very specific and potent attack against Windows environments. It forces a target machine, often a domain controller, DC, to authenticate to a server controlled by the attacker. It uses a function within Microsoft's Encrypting File System Remote Protocol, MSEFS-RPC. The attacker sends a specific command, EFS-RP at OpenFiler raw, to the target DC, compelling it to perform NTLM, NT-LAN Manager, authentication against the attacker's listener. The attacker captures this NTLM authentication attempt, usually via an NTLM relay tool like NTLM-relayX.py. And here's the really dangerous part. They relay this captured authentication to another service, typically Active Directory Certificate Services, ADCS. If ADCS is configured insecurely, which is common, the attacker can use the relayed NTLM credentials of the DC to request and obtain a digital certificate in the name of the domain controller. With that certificate, the attacker can then authenticate back to the domain as the DC itself, effectively gaining administrator-level privileges and potentially full control over the entire Active Directory domain. It's a powerful privilege escalation technique exploiting interactions between EFSRPC, NTLM relaying, and ADCS. Tools like PetitPotam.py and Rubius.exe are often involved in executing or leveraging this attack. Network-level session hijacking, attacking the protocols.
Focusing on transport and internet protocols.
Okay, so we've spent a good amount of time on the application layer, all those ways to mess with session IDs. Let's shift back down now to the foundational network layer. You mentioned earlier that network-level hijacking is sometimes preferred by attackers. Why is that again?
Right. Moving back down the stack, network-level hijacking targets the core transport protocols, primarily TCP and UDP, and the Internet Protocol, IP. The appeal for attackers is often its universality. Exploits at this layer can potentially affect any application using these standard protocols without needing specific knowledge of how each individual web application handles its sessions. It doesn't usually require direct access to the host system itself, just access to the network path. And crucially, successful network-level attacks like sniffing or sequence number prediction often gather the critical information needed to then launch more targeted application-level attacks later on. It's about attacking the fundamental communication mechanisms. B, the TCP three-way handshake, a foundation to exploit.
And to really get these network attacks, we need that solid understanding of how a basic TCP connection even starts, right? That three-way handshake. Can you quickly recap that?
Absolutely. It's fundamental. The TCP three-way handshake establishes a reliable connection. One, first, the client sends a SYN packet, synchronize, to the server. This packet includes an initial sequence number, ISN, basically saying, I want to connect, and this is my starting number. The client is now in the SYN sent state. 2. The server receives the SYN. If it accepts the connection, it sends back a SYN ACK packet. This acknowledges the client's ISN, usually by incrementing it, and includes the server's own ISN. The server is now in the sing receive state. 3. Finally, the client receives the SYN ACK. It acknowledges the server's ISN, again, usually by incrementing it by sending an ACK packet acknowledgement. Once this ACK is sent, the client considers the connection established. 4. When the server receives the client's ACK, it also moves to the established state. Now, data can flow reliably back and forth. And remember, closing the connection also involves specific flags, typically SYN finish for a graceful shutdown or RST reset for an abrupt termination. The key pieces of information throughout this are the IP addresses, the port numbers identifying the applications, and those crucial sequence numbers which track the bytes of data and are constantly changing, making them the prime target for prediction and manipulation in hijacking attacks.
Yeah.
TCP/IP hijacking. Seizing control with spoof packets.
Okay, so with that handshake and those sequence numbers in mind, how does an attacker actually use them to take over a TCP/IP session at this level? It sounds like they need precision timing.
Precision is key, yes. TCP/IP hijacking at this level fundamentally relies on injecting spoof packets into an already established connection to seize control. Typically, for this to work effectively, the attacker needs to be on the same local network segment as the victim machine. The target server they're communicating with could be anywhere, though. Here's the general flow. 1. The attacker first sniffs the victim's ongoing connection to observe the flow of packets and, most importantly, to predict the next sequence number, NSN, the victim is expected to use. 2. Using the victim's IP address, spoofing, the attacker crafts a packet containing malicious data and sends it to the server with that predicted sequence number. 3. If the timing and prediction are right, the server accepts this spoof packet as the next legitimate packet from the victim. The server processes it, updates its own expected sequence number, and sends an acknowledgement ACK back to the victim's IP address. 4. Now, the real victim machine eventually sends its actual next packet, but the server, having already processed the attacker's packet, sees the victim's packet as having an old, incorrect sequence number and likely ignores it. Or, the victim receives the ACK from the server for the attacker's packet, which it wasn't expecting, and gets confused. Either way, the connection becomes desynchronized. 5. The attacker continues this process, predicting sequence numbers, spoofing packets from the victim's IP. The server synchronizes its state with the attacker's packets, ignoring or dropping the legitimate packets from the actual victim. The victim's connection effectively hangs or breaks. 5. The attacker continues this process. 6. The attacker is now communicating with the server, impersonating the victim, achieving a successful local session hijack. DIP spoofing, source-routed packets.
You mentioned IP spoofing. What about using source-routed packets in that context? How does that specific technique work?
Source routing is an older IP option, less common now, but still relevant conceptually. It allows the sender of a packet to specify the path, the sequence of routers, the packet should take to reach its destination, rather than letting the routers decide dynamically. In an IP spoofing attack using source routing, the attacker spoofs the IP address of a trusted host, one the server already trusts. They then use the source routing option to try and force the return packets from the server to travel back along a path the attacker controls or can monitor. The idea is to combine IP spoofing, pretending to be trusted, with source routing, controlling the reply path, to establish a connection or inject commands. The attacker would still need to predict sequence numbers and potentially desynchronize the connection, injecting their forged packets before the real client can respond. It's a way to try and overcome the issue of not seeing replies in a basic spoofing attack, but it relies on intermediate routers honoring the source route option, which many disable today for security reasons, ERST hijacking. Forcibly resetting connections.
Okay, and we talked about the reset flag earlier for desynchronization. Can attackers use that more directly just to kill connections? How does RST hijacking work specifically?
Yes, exactly. RST hijacking isn't necessarily about taking over the session, but about forcibly terminating it. The attacker injects a TCP packet with the RST reset flag turned on into the network, targeting one or both ends of an established connection. To make this RST packet look legitimate and be accepted by the receiving machine, the attacker needs to spoof the source IP address of the other party in the connection. And crucially, they need to guess or predict the correct acknowledgement number that the receiving machine is currently expecting. If the spoofed source IP looks right, and the acknowledgement number falls within the expected window, the receiving machine will accept the RST packet as authentic and immediately tear down its side of the connection. The victim just sees their connection unexpectedly drop, often thinking the server or the network had a problem. Tools like packet crafting utilities, Callsoft Packet Builder was mentioned, and analysis tools like TCP dump are essential for performing or detecting this. F-blind and UDP hijacking, when you can't see the response.
Right, and you mentioned blind attacks earlier, operating without seeing the replies. Let's revisit blind hijacking and also touch on UDP hijacking.
Sure, so blind hijacking is essentially TCP/IP hijacking, injecting spoof packets with predicted sequence numbers, but performed under conditions where the attacker cannot sniff the network to see the server's responses. They might be on a different network segment, or maybe encryption prevents them from reading the replies. So they inject their malicious data or commands, but they're doing it blind. They have to guess the sequence numbers accurately and hope their commands have the intended effect, but they get no direct confirmation. It's much harder than hijacking where you can see the traffic flow. If seeing the response is necessary for the attack goal, then a man-in-the-middle attack is usually a much better approach for the attacker. Now, UDP, User Datagram Protocol hijacking, is a bit different because UDP itself is different. UDP is connectionless. There's no handshake, no sequence numbers, no synchronization like in TCP. This inherently makes it easier to attack in some ways. In a UDP hijack, an attacker typically intercepts a UDP request from a victim to a server. The attacker then sends a forged reply back to the victim, spoofing the server's IP address before the real server has a chance to respond.
Since there's no session state or sequence numbers to worry about, the victim might just accept the first reply it receives, which is the attacker's fake one. The attacker can insert false information or redirect the victim. Often, an MITM position helps the attacker ensure the real server's reply is blocked or delayed so the victim accepts the fake one. GMITM attack. Using forged ICMP and ARP spoofing, rerouting traffic.
Okay, so MITM is clearly a powerful technique here. How specifically does it leverage lower-level protocols like ICMP and ARP to reroute traffic and get into that middle position at the network level?
Right, getting into that man-in-the-middle position on a network often involves manipulating these fundamental local network protocols. One way is using forged ICMP, Internet Control Message Protocol packets. ICMP is normally used for network diagnostics and error messages like host unreachable or redirect. An attacker can send specially crafted forged ICMP redirect messages to a victim host. These messages tell the victim, hey, for future packets to server X, don't send them directly to the router. Send them to me, the attacker's machine. Instead, I have a better path. If the victim host accepts this forged redirect, its traffic to the target server now flows to the attacker. Perhaps even more common on local networks is ARP, Address Resolution Protocol, spoofing, also known as ARP cache poisoning. Remember, ARP is how devices on a local Ethernet network figure out the physical MAC address associated with a specific IP address. An attacker broadcasts forged ARP replies onto the network. For example, they might send an ARP reply claiming that their MAC address corresponds to the IP address of the network's default gateway, the router. If other hosts on the network accept this malicious ARP reply, they'll update their local ARP cache, their IP to MAC mapping table. Now, any traffic they intend to send to the gateway, which is most internet traffic, gets sent to the attacker's machine instead. The attacker can then forward it onto the real gateway after inspecting or modifying it, achieving that transparent MITM position. 4. Session hijacking tools. The attacker's arsenal.
Okay, we've covered a huge amount of theory and techniques. Let's talk practicalities. What specific tools are out there that ethical hackers and, well, malicious actors too, might actually use to perform or simulate these kinds of session hijacking attacks?
Yeah, understanding the tools is crucial for defenders too. There's quite a range, from general network tools to more specialized web security kits. One mentioned is Hijacking. This is described as an HTTP toolkit for security research. It essentially acts as a man-in-the-middle HTTP proxy. It logs requests and responses, has search features, includes an HTTP client to let you manually craft or replay requests, and importantly, it can intercept traffic, allowing you to pause, examine, modify, and then forward requests or responses. It's very hands-on for manipulating web traffic. Then there's Kaido. This sounds similar in function to web security auditing toolkit. It also intercepts HTTP traffic in real time as you browse. You can use it to customize and test requests, maybe automatically modify things using regular expressions, and resend requests to probe endpoints. Tools like these are invaluable for testing web application security. Another powerful one mentioned is BetterCap. This isn't just for web stuff, it's a broader reconnaissance and attack framework. It's written in Go, making it portable.
It can handle attacks on Wi-Fi networks, Bluetooth Low Energy, even wireless keyboards and mice, plus standard IPv4 and IPv6 networks. It bundles many capabilities needed for network MITM attacks, sniffing, spoofing, etc. It's like a Swiss Army knife for network pen testers. And the list goes on, of course. Tools like Burp Suite and OFCAP are extremely popular, comprehensive web application security testing platforms with strong proxy and interception capabilities. There are frameworks like Websploit and specific tools like SoulStrip for trying to downgrade HTTPS connections, or Hijack, though that might be older.
Right. And it's always worth repeating, knowing about these tools isn't about encouraging their misuse. For ethical hackers and security professionals, understanding how these tools work is absolutely essential for finding vulnerabilities in your own systems and building effective defenses. You have to know the offense to play good defense. V-session hijacking countermeasures, protecting against the threat, A-session hijacking detection methods, spotting the signs. So, moving to defense. We've established that detecting these attacks is really tough. They often fly under the radar until it's too late. But are there any signs, any methods we can use to try and spot a session hijack in progress, even if it's subtle?
Detection is difficult precisely because a successful hijack often looks like legitimate traffic from the server's perspective. But there can be subtle indicators. Sometimes the only noticeable symptoms might be performance-related, maybe a sudden unexplained spike in network activity that makes the system sluggish. Or perhaps the server seems unusually busy because it's trying to handle requests from both the legitimate user and the hijacker simultaneously, leading to conflicts or errors. In terms of actual detection methods, we can think of manual and automatic approaches. The manual method involves skilled security analysts actively monitoring network traffic using packet sniffers like Wireshark or Steel Central Packet Analyzer. They look for anomalies, suspicious patterns. For example, seeing ARP packets constantly trying to update an entry for a specific machine, or observing frames where the source MS address for a client's IP suddenly changes, or detecting those ACK storms we mentioned. These can all be indicators of ARP spoofing or connection desynchronization attempts. If they suspect a machine is compromised, they might try to manually force a correct ARP entry into the network's cache to isolate it. The automatic method relies on security technologies. Deploying intrusion detection systems, IDS, and intrusion prevention systems, IPS, is key here. These systems sit on the network and monitor traffic flows. An IDS analyzes traffic against a database of known attack signatures or behavioral anomalies. If it detects something suspicious that matches a session hijacking pattern, it generates an alert for security personnel to investigate. An IPS goes one step further. When it detects traffic matching an attack signature, it can actively block that traffic, preventing the malicious packets from reaching their destination. It acts as an automated guard at the network perimeter or key internal points. B, protecting against session hijacking. Best practices for everyone.
Okay, so detection is tricky, but possible. Let's talk prevention. From a high-level view, what are the absolute must-do safeguards? What should everyone, from individual users right up to large organizations, be doing to protect themselves against session hijacking?
Protection really requires a layered approach, hitting the problem from multiple angles. There's no single magic bullet. Fundamentally, you need secure communication channels. Always use protocols like SSH, Secure Shell, or OpenSSH for remote access and management. Never telnet or plain FTP. For web traffic, enforce HTTPS everywhere using TLS.
Applications need robust logout functionality. Clicking logout must actually invalidate the session token on the server side, not just clear a cookie in the browser. Critically, generate new session IDs after successful login. Don't reuse a pre-login session ID, as that enables session fixation, and only accept session IDs generated by the server. Never trust one supplied by the client. Encrypt all sensitive data in transit, including those session IDs. This fits into a broader defense-in-depth strategy, multiple layers of security controls. Thinking about the session IDs themselves, make them long and truly random strings. The longer and more random, the harder they are to guess or brute force. On the network side, use switches instead of old-style hubs. Switches limit collision domains and make sniffing much harder, mitigating risks like ARP spoofing on local segments. Web applications should implement strict session timeouts, automatically destroying sessions after a period of inactivity. And absolutely avoid putting session IDs directly in URLs or query strings. They should be transmitted via more secure means, like HTTP headers using cookies. Keep all client-side security software, antivirus, anti-malware, and server-side protection software up to date. This helps catch malware that might steal cookies or compromise browsers. Use strong authentication mechanisms where possible. Protocols like Kerberos provide much better security than simple passwords. Consider peer-to-peer VPNs for securing communication between specific endpoints. Network administrators should configure anti-spoofing rules on gateway routers and firewalls to drop packets with internal source IPs arriving from external interfaces. Use IDSeeps or tools like ARP Watch specifically to monitor for ARP cache poisoning attempts. Encourage users to enable browser features that help verify website authenticity, relying on trusted certifying authorities and checking for certificate errors. For file transfers, mandate secure protocols like SFTP, SSH File Transfer Protocol, AS2, or FTPS, FTP Secure, which incorporate encryption and often digital certificates. Basic security hygiene is also vital. Use unique, strong passwords for different accounts. Educate employees about phishing, social engineering, and safe browsing habits. Minimize unnecessary remote access to sensitive systems. Users can configure browser settings to restrict or clear cookies, especially third-party ones. System admins must apply security patches promptly, especially those addressing vulnerabilities in the underlying TCP/IP stack or operating system. Consider advanced measures like DNS-based authentication of named entities, DNS, for stronger domain validation. Disable HTTP request compression if vulnerable to attacks like crime. Vigorously filter for cross-site scripts at the application firewall or within the application. Keep web browsers updated. Also, ensure cookies have the HTTP-only property set. This prevents client-side scripts, like those injected via XSS, from accessing the session cookie. For Windows environments, employ SMB signing to ensure the integrity and authenticity of server message block traffic. Universally, apply SSL/TLS correctly across the board. Implement multi-factor authentication, MFA, wherever possible. It's one of the single most effective defenses. Use the same site cookie attribute, set to lax or strict, to control when browsers send cookies with cross-site requests, mitigating CSRF. Actively monitor session activity logs for anomalies like impossible travel, logins from different locations simultaneously, unusual access times, or excessively long sessions. Consider binding sessions to the user's IP address, although this can cause issues with dynamic IPs or mobile users. Explore behavioral biometrics for continuous authentication based on user interaction patterns. Implement challenge response mechanisms like CAPI-THA if suspicious activity is detected within a session, and enforce absolute session timeouts in addition to inactivity timeouts. See web development guidelines to prevent session hijacking.
That's a comprehensive list. Now, focusing specifically on the people building the websites and applications, the developers, the architects, what critical security guidelines should they be embedding right into their development process from day one?
Developers are absolutely crucial here. Secure development practices are non-negotiable. Key things they must do include: create lengthy, complex, and truly random session keys. Use a cryptographically secure pseudorandom number generator, CSPRNG. Aim for at least 128 bits of entropy. Regenerate the session ID immediately after successful authentication. This is the primary defense against session fixation. Don't let the user carry a pre-login ID into their authenticated session. Encrypt all sensitive data and the session keys themselves during transmission. This means enforcing HTTPS for the entire site, not just the login page. Use TLS 1.2 or higher. Ensure sessions are properly invalidated on the server side upon logout. Don't just rely on the client clearing cookies. Also, implement strict inactivity timeouts and consider absolute timeouts. Design applications to minimize the impact of network eavesdropping. Assume traffic could be intercepted and protect sensitive data accordingly. Keep the lifespan of sessions and cookies as short as reasonably possible for the application's functionality. Use restrictive caching directives, cache control, not cache, no store, pragma, no cache, expires. 0 for any pages handling sensitive data or session operations to prevent intermediaries or browsers from caching them. Use restrictive caching directives. Cache control. Avoid creating sessions for unauthenticated users unless absolutely necessary. If needed, keep their privileges extremely limited. Use restrictive caching directives. Cache control. Make sure all session cookies have the HTTP only and secure flags set. Secure ensures they're only sent over HTTPS. HTTP only prevents JavaScript access. Use restrictive caching directives. Cache control. Consider verifying that requests within a session consistently originate from the same IP address or user agent string, although be mindful of potential usability issues, like changing IPs on mobile networks. Use restrictive caching directives. Cache control. Look into continuous device verification techniques or risk-based authentication that might require re-authentication or step-up authentication for particularly sensitive actions within a session. Use restrictive caching directives, cache control. For things like VPNs, ensure strong authentication and integrity verification for the endpoints themselves. Use restrictive caching directives, cache control. Crucially, destroy the server-side session data when a user deauthenticates, logs out, not just when the session cookie expires on the client side. Use restrictive caching directives, cache control. Always redirect HTTP requests to HTTPS using permanent redirects, 301. Use restrictive caching directives, cache control. Finally, leverage secure, well-maintained web frameworks that handle much of the session management complexity securely by default. Don't try to roll your own session management crypto unless you are an expert. DWeb user guidelines to prevent session hijacking.
Okay, and flipping it around one last time. For us, the everyday users navigating the web, what are the practical, actionable steps we can take personally to defend our online sessions?
End-user awareness and good habits are a vital layer of defense. Here's what you, as a user, can do. Be extremely cautious about clicking links in emails or instant messages, especially if they seem unexpected, urgent, or too good to be true. Type URLs directly into your browser when possible. Use a personal firewall on your computer. Both Windows and macOS have them built in. Make sure they're enabled. Manage your browser cookies. Use settings to block third-party cookies. Consider extensions that help manage cookies or clear them automatically on exit for non-essential sites. Always verify website authenticity. Look for the padlock icon in HTTPS in the address bar. Click the padlock to inspect the site certificate. Does the name match? Is it issued by a trusted authority? Be wary of certificate warnings. Always verify website authenticity. Look for the padlock icon and HTTPS. Clear your browser history, cache, and cookies periodically, especially after using public computers or performing sensitive transactions. Always verify website authenticity. Look for the padlock icon in HTTPS. Always prefer HTTPS. Use browser extensions like HTTPS everywhere that try to force secure connections. If a site handling sensitive data isn't using HTTPS, consider not using it. Always verify website authenticity. Look for the padlock icon in HTTPS. Explicitly log out of websites when you're finished using their logout button. Don't just close the browser tab or window as your session might remain active on the server. Always verify website authenticity. Look for the padlock icon in HTTPS. Regularly review your browser extensions and add-ons. Disable or remove any you don't recognize or absolutely need, especially those from untrusted sources. Always verify website authenticity. Look for the padlock icon in HTTPS. Consider using one-time passwords, OTPs, generated by authenticator apps or hardware tokens, part of MFA, for critical accounts like banking or email. Always verify website authenticity. Look for the padlock icon in HTTPS. Keep your antivirus and anti-malware software up to date and run regular scans. This helps catch malware that might steal session cookies. Always verify website authenticity. Look for the padlock icon in HTTPS. When conducting sensitive transactions, banking, shopping, over public Wi-Fi networks, if you must, use a reputable VPN service to encrypt your traffic. Always verify website authenticity. Look for the padlock icon in HTTPS. Turn off the setting on your phone or laptop that automatically connects to open Wi-Fi networks. This prevents accidentally connecting to malicious hotspots set up by attackers. Always verify website authenticity. Look for the padlock icon in HTTPS. Keep your operating system, web browser, and any plugins, like PDF readers, Flash Player if you still use it, updated with the latest security patches. Always verify website authenticity. Look for the padlock icon in HTTPS. Use encrypted messaging and email services when transmitting sensitive information. Always verify website authenticity. Look for the padlock icon in HTTPS. Avoid letting your browser save your passwords. Use a dedicated secure password manager instead. Always verify website authenticity. Look for the padlock icon in HTTPS. Use incognito or private browsing mode when using shared or public computers to prevent your session data and history from being saved locally. Always verify website authenticity. Look for the padlock icon HTTPS. Be mindful of app permissions you grant on your phone or computer. Does that game really need access to your contacts or location? eSession hijacking detection tools.
Okay, we mentioned general tools like Wireshark and IDSFPS for detection. Are there any more specialized tools specifically marketed for helping detect session hijacking attempts or related anomalies?
Yes. Beyond the general-purpose network analysis and intrusion detection systems, there are platforms that integrate various capabilities helpful for detecting indicators of session hijacking. One example mentioned in the material is USM, Anywhere, from Alien Vault, now AT&T Cybersecurity. This is a unified security management platform. It combines several functions: asset discovery, vulnerability assessment, intrusion detection, both network-based NIs and host-based HIDs, behavioral monitoring, and security information and event management, SIEM. By correlating events from all these sources, a SIEM can potentially identify complex attack patterns indicative of session hijacking that might be missed by individual tools. For instance, correlating an unusual login location from ID's firewall logs with subsequent anomalous activity within the session from application logs could trigger a high-priority alert. And as we discussed, Wireshark remains indispensable for deep-dive manual analysis when an incident is suspected. An analyst can use it to capture traffic and meticulously examine TCP sequence numbers, flags, session cookie values, and timing to find direct evidence of hijacking. Other tools, often mentioned in the broader network security and SIEM space, include platforms like Quantum IPS, SolarWinds Security Event Manager, IBM Security Network IPS, and LogRhythm. These systems focus on monitoring network traffic, logging events, correlating data, and alerting on security policy violations or suspicious activities, including patterns that might suggest session hijacking. Approaches to prevent session hijacking. Advanced.
All right, let's look at a couple of slightly more advanced, perhaps more systemic approaches to prevention that go beyond the basic user and developer guidelines.
Definitely. There are some powerful mechanisms that can be implemented at the web server or protocol level. One really important one is HTTP Strict Transport Security, or HSTS. This is a security policy mechanism that a web server can announce to browsers. When a browser sees an HSTS header from a website, it makes a note. For the next X amount of time, example 6 months, I will only connect to this site using HTTPS. Even if the user types HTTP or clicks an insecure link, the browser will automatically upgrade the connection to HTTPS before sending the request. This effectively eliminates the window for SSL stripping attacks, a type of MITM attack that forces a user onto an unencrypted HTTP connection and ensures communication is always encrypted, protecting session cookies in transit. It's a powerful way to enforce HTTPS. Another advanced technique, though perhaps less widely deployed currently, is token binding. This aims to cryptographically bind security tokens like session cookies to the specific TLS layer connection. The basic idea is that when a TLS connection is established, the client generates a unique public-private key pair just for that connection. When it sends a security token, like a session cookie, to the server, it also includes a signature generated with its private key, covering the token and some TLS connection details. The server, which receives the client's public key during the TLS handshake, can verify this signature, the key benefit. If an attacker somehow steals the session cookie, for example, via XSS or sniffing a different insecure connection, they cannot successfully replay it over their own TLS connection to the server because they don't possess the correct private key needed to generate a valid signature for their TLS connection. The token is effectively bound to the original legitimate TLS tunnel. G approaches to prevent MITM attacks. Comprehensive.
Since man-in-the-middle is such a common theme underlying many of these hijacking methods, what are the big picture strategies to shut down MITM attacks more broadly?
Preventing MITM requires a defense-in-depth approach, tackling it in multiple layers. DNS over HTTPS, DOH, or DNS over TLS, DOT, are crucial starting points. Encrypting your DNS queries prevents attackers from easily snooping on which websites you're visiting or redirecting you to malicious sites via DNS manipulation, a common prelude to MITM. For wireless, WPA3 encryption offers significant security improvements over WPA2, making it much harder for attackers to crack Wi-Fi passwords or intercept traffic on wireless networks, a common hunting ground for MITM. Using a trusted virtual private network, VPN, is a powerful defense, especially on untrusted networks like public Wi-Fi. A VPN creates an encrypted tunnel for all your traffic, making it unreadable to potential eavesdroppers on the local network.
Multi-factor authentication, MFA2FA, doesn't directly stop MITM traffic interception, but it makes stolen credentials much less useful, preventing account takeover even if an attacker manages to phish or sniff a password during an MITM attack. Using a password manager encourages the use of strong, unique passwords for every site. This limits the damage if one set of credentials is compromised via MITM, as it won't unlock other accounts. Adopting zero-trust security principles within organizations is a major shift. Instead of trusting users or devices just because they are inside the network, zero trust requires continuous verification and least privilege access for every resource request. This makes it much harder for an attacker who gains an MITM position to actually access anything valuable. Public key infrastructure, PKI, and proper certificate validation are fundamental. Ensuring clients rigorously check server certificates, and potentially vice versa with client certificates, helps prevent attackers from successfully impersonating legitimate servers in an MITM scenario. Certificate pinning can also help, though it has management challenges. Network segmentation limits the blast radius. Dividing the network into smaller, isolated zones prevents an attacker who compromises one segment from easily intercepting traffic across the entire network. HIPSec, Internet Protocol Security, a deeper dive into IP layer security.
And finally, let's circle back to IPsec. You mentioned it earlier as a way to secure IP communications fundamentally. Can you dive a bit deeper into how IPsec works and how it helps prevent these kinds of network-level attacks?
Absolutely. IPsec, Internet Protocol Security, is a suite of protocols defined by the IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force, specifically designed to add security directly at the Internet Protocol, IP layer 3 of the OSI model. It aims to secure IP communications by authenticating and encrypting each individual IP packet of a communication session. The key benefits IPsec provides are network-level peer authentication, verifying the identity of the communicating devices, data origin authentication, ensuring packets actually came from the claimed source, data integrity, guaranteeing that packets haven't been modified in transit, data confidentiality, encryption, protecting the contents of the packets from eavesdropping, replay protection, preventing attackers from capturing and resending legitimate packets. IPsec involves several components, including security protocols, AH and ESP, key management protocols like IKE Internet Key Exchange, often using ISAMP Internet Security Association and Key Management Protocol, and security policies that decide what traffic should be secured and how. The actual IPsec process involves negotiation between the two endpoints to establish security associations, SSAs. An SA defines the specific security parameters, algorithms, keys, etc., to be used for protecting traffic in one direction. Typically, two SAs are needed for bidirectional communication. Key exchange happens via IKE to securely establish shared secret keys. Once the SAs and keys are set up, the IPsec driver on each machine intercepts outgoing packets matching the security policy, applies the agreed-upon protection, authentication, and honor encryption, and sends them out. The receiving machine's IPsec driver uses the corresponding SA and keys to verify the integrity, authenticity, and/or decrypt the packet before passing the original data up the network stack. Now, IPsec operates in two main modes. Transport mode. In this mode, IPsec protects only the payload, the data part, of the original IP packet. The original IP header remains largely untouched, just modified slightly to indicate IPsec protection. This mode is typically used for end-to-end communication between two hosts. It provides security for the data itself, but doesn't hide the original source and destination IP addresses. Tunnel mode. This mode provides more comprehensive protection. IPsec takes the entire original IP packet, header and payload, encapsulates it, and makes it the payload of a new IP packet. This new outer packet has its own IP header, usually specifying IPsec gateways or endpoints as the source and destination. Tunnel mode is essential for creating VPNs, connecting entire networks securely across the internet, or connecting a remote host to a corporate network. It protects the original packet entirely, including hiding the original source and destination IPs from intermediate networks. And within these modes, you have two main security protocols. Authentication header, AH, provides strong integrity protection and data origin authentication for the IP packet, including parts of the header that don't change in transit. It also provides anti-replay protection. However, AH does not provide confidentiality, doesn't encrypt the data. Encapsulation Security Payload, ESP, provides all the services of AH, integrity, authentication, anti-replay, plus confidentiality through encryption. ESP is generally preferred because it offers both secrecy and integrity. It encrypts the payload in transport mode and the entire inner packet in tunnel mode. So by applying AH, or more commonly ESP at the IP layer, IPsec provides a very strong defense against network-level sniffing, data modification, and IP spoofing for the traffic it protects. iSession hijacking prevention tools.
Okay, one last category of tools. We talked about tools attackers use and tools for detection. What about tools specifically designed to help prevent session hijacking by finding the vulnerabilities before they can be exploited? The proactive defense tools.
Right. The prevention side often involves tools that analyze code or running applications for security weaknesses. One example mentioned is Checkmarx 1 SAST, Static Application Security Testing. SAST tools analyze the application's source code without running it. They look for known vulnerability patterns, insecure coding practices, logic flaws, etc., that could lead to vulnerabilities like session fixation, XSS, or insecure handling of session tokens. Finding these issues early in the development lifecycle is much cheaper and more effective than finding them after deployment. Checkmarx also integrates open source analysis, OSA, to find vulnerabilities in third-party libraries. Another tool mentioned is Fiddler. While we discussed it as a debugging proxy useful for testing, which aids prevention, it allows developers and testers to manually inspect all HTTPS traffic their application generates. They can see exactly how session cookies are being set, transmitted, and handled, check for flags like secure and HTTP only, look for information leakage, and manually test how the application responds to manipulated requests. This hands-on inspection is invaluable for uncovering subtle session management flaws. And then you have a range of dynamic application security testing DAST tools and vulnerability scanners like Nessus, Invicti, formerly NetSparker, and Wapiti. DAST tools test the running application, probing it from the outside like an attacker would, looking for vulnerabilities like XSS, CSRF, weak session management, insecure configurations, etc. These tools automate the process of finding exploitable flaws in deployed web applications. Using a combination of SAST, DAST, and manual testing provides the most comprehensive approach to preventing session hijacking vulnerabilities.
Wow. Okay, we have really gone deep into EC Council's Module 11 on session hijacking. That was a lot to cover. From your perspective, what's the single biggest thing that stands out from this whole discussion?
For me, it's really the realization of how session security relies on so many different layers working correctly. It's not just one thing. We saw how fundamental weaknesses, sometimes even in TCP/IP itself, or just weak session ID generation, create opportunities. We saw the huge range of attack vectors, from straightforward sniffing and prediction at the application level, right up to sophisticated man-in-the-browser attacks or network-level exploits like PetitPotam targeting core infrastructure. But the flip side, the positive takeaway, is the crucial importance of that layered defense. Secure coding, strong authentication like MFA, proper HTTPS implementation, robust network protocols like IPsec, proactive vulnerability scanning, user education. You really need it all working together. It truly is a constant cat and mouse game.
Absolutely. It hammers home that point about understanding both sides of the coin, the offense and the defense. It's not enough just to know that vulnerabilities exist. You have to understand how they're exploited to build those really effective strategic layers of protection. We can't just put up one wall and hope for the best.
And it leads to a thought, doesn't it? Given how much of our lives, banking, work, social connections depends on these active online sessions, how confident can we be that we're truly logged out or secure if that little session ID, that temporary key, is potentially the weakest link? What's the one thing you, listening now, will do differently to protect your online sessions after hearing all this?
That is a powerful question to ponder. Definitely makes you think. I'd encourage everyone listening to take a moment, maybe review your own online habits. Think about the sites where you click Remember Me. And if you're involved in building or managing systems, revisit your session management protocols. Maybe that checkbox deserves a second look. Well, that brings us to the end of this deep dive into session hijacking. But our exploration of ethical hacking concepts is far from over. Next time, we're tackling another critical area: how attackers and, of course, ethical hackers manage to evade crucial network security defenses like intrusion detection systems and firewalls to get inside infrastructure. It's going to be fascinating. You won't want to miss it. Thank you so much for joining us on the deep dive. We'll catch you next time.